So we'll be talking about loyalty. I think before I start, loyalty is a very big term that can mean a lot of different things. So I think to keep things simple, we're talking about behavioural loyalty, which I would argue is the main one that matters. So things like repurchase, share of wallet, etc. It's not really looking at the broader concept of, say, emotional loyalty, which is really a topic for another day. So here are some truths about loyalty. These are things that are various assumptions that have existed and we've all probably heard over time. So customer loyalty does vary significantly across brands. Superior loyalty can be a key source of advantage for brands. So marketing departments should naturally look to improve loyalty. And then extracting more from your loyal customers is the best way to grow. So we'll revisit these assumptions a little bit later. But firstly, a case study. This is a Brazilian toothpaste brand with a very nice growth story. You can see across the 4 years, its market share has risen strongly. Also, its penetration has risen strongly. So market share increased by 124%, penetration by 82%. But the question is, what about its customer loyalty over this period? So look, we'll revisit that as well later, but it does bring us to our question for today. How do you grow your brand? What's the best way? Is it through targeting your existing customers? And that's trying to improve loyalty, share of wallet, cross-selling, anything where you're trying to extract more value from your existing customers. Or simply to gain more customers, acquisition. And of course it's both, but what's the priority? I'm probably giving away what our view is by the name of my topic here, but that's what we'll talk about today. So look, loyalty it's everywhere. People talk about it in marketing constantly. There's a huge amount of academic research. As you can see, you type it into Google Scholar, 177,000 hits of research papers that refer to customer loyalty. There's a huge number of conferences dedicated to loyalty. So loyalty is a hot topic, and it always has been in marketing. And I think there's some common beliefs that underpin that focus on customer loyalty. It's cheaper to retain existing customers than to win new ones. It's easy to sell more to existing customers than to win new ones. Loyal customers are less price sensitive, so presumably you can sell more, you can charge them more, and it also increases profitability because you can charge them more. And finally, this idea that customers want this deep engagement, this relationship with your brand. And on that topic of engagement, I think that's a topic that's really fashionable, I would say, and often it's almost replaced the word loyalty in many ways. This idea that customers want to be close to you and you want them to be close to the brand. And I think, to be blunt, I think ultimately that's about loyalty. You're trying to extract more from those customers by having that close relationship with them. And just to give you a feel for this idea of customer engagement, how fashionable it is, this just shows you the Google searches for it, and you can see it's a clear upward trend. So, a lot of talk about loyalty. I think clearly the topic of my talk is the loyalty fallacy. So this is the contrarian view. So as Piers mentioned in the introduction, there is a lot of evidence that loyalty shouldn't be the focus. And I'll present a few elements of this contrarian view now. Number one, customers don't want a deep engagement with your brand. Sometimes they do, but most of them don't. Number two, potential gains via acquisition are much higher than via loyalty. And number three, which is probably the key one, loyalty doesn't vary much between brands, and it's actually really hard to outperform your competitors on loyalty. So let's look at these arguments now. So number one, most customers don't want deep engagement with your brand. A lot of people don't care about brands. And I have this in my view. I can barely think of a brand that I really care deeply about. And there's plenty of evidence there. A study in the UK showed that 94% of brands could disappear and UK consumers couldn't care less. 77% of people in a different survey said they have no relationship with any brands, not even a single one, as they would define a relationship. And a global study which included Singapore, 87% of Singaporeans said, I don't think brands are open and honest in general. So is that someone you want to have a relationship with, or something you want to have a relationship with? So it's summed up well by this cartoon here, I think, this view. So that's argument number one. Customers don't care as much about your brand as you might think they do. Number two, potential gains via acquisition are much higher than increased loyalty. And look, there's quite a bit of academic evidence to support this. So this is probably the most compelling. Some analysis done by the IPA, which is the marketing industry body up in the UK. They looked at 880 marketing case studies. So marketing initiatives that were aimed to drive some sort of business outcome. And amongst the initiatives that aimed to achieve increased loyalty, only 9% were successful. So 91% failed. Whereas for increased acquisition, 46% worked. So basically almost everyone that went out and said, I'm going to improve my company, my brand's loyalty, failed. About half who targeted acquisition actually did achieve their goals. Another quick study, this is a longitudinal study amongst pharma brands for over 10 years, and the clear conclusion was when brands varied in their growth, in their size, it was typically due to unusual acquisition, whether higher than expected acquisition or lower than expected. Loyalty didn't really have any significant effect in most cases. So that was point number two. Point number three, loyalty doesn't vary much between brands, and above average loyalty is difficult to achieve. This is the double jeopardy effect. It's been very much popularised by Byron Sharp in recent years, but it's been around since like 1963, this idea that smaller brands get hurt in two ways. They have fewer customers, but they also have less loyal customers. But the difference is, the loyalty difference is usually quite minor. So, to give you a pretty graph to show what this looks like, you see the penetrations in the blue. The larger brands have many more customers than the smaller brands, but loyalty doesn't vary too much. The bigger brands tend to have slightly more loyalty. So the conclusion from the double jeopardy law, and it really does apply in almost any market you can look into, was that loyalty is primarily a function of your brand's penetration. So it's quite difficult to use marketing to affect loyalty. So just on double jeopardy, this is another way you can look at it. You see market share or penetration on the horizontal axis, some sort of loyalty measure, and they all show the same thing on the vertical axis. And as your market share increases, your loyalty increases. So it's very hard to achieve loyalty beyond that double jeopardy line. And to give you an example, there was one study I saw where they looked at 450 brands and they analysed their loyalty relative to their penetration, and only 10% varied significantly from that line. So 90% had completely predictable loyalty metrics based on their market share or their penetration. So I'll give you some examples. Double jeopardy has been shown in so many categories. I could stand here all day and show you all the categories that it applies in. But here's one from the auto industry in France. You can see very clear correlation between market share. So this is ranked by market share and by the loyalty measure, which is repurchase of the same brand. So I owned a Renault before, I bought another one this time. The other point is that loyalty doesn't vary as much as share or penetration. So you can see the difference between the largest and the smallest brand. Market share is 16 times as large. Loyalty is only twice as large. That's a very common pattern. You see huge differences in market share and penetration, small differences, relatively speaking, in loyalty. And look, another way to look at double jeopardy is just look at the rankings. You can see that if you ever rank it like this, generally the rankings will match up. Number one, market share will typically be number one in loyalty, or at least roundabout. And as you get to the smaller brands, they both have fewer customers, but also less loyal customers. Another way to show this is through a chart like this. So you see market share on the bottom, the loyalty measure on the vertical axis. You'll see there's a clear correlation. This is the same data we saw on the previous slide. But what you should notice is that the line is quite flat, so that reinforces the point that loyalty doesn't vary much. It certainly correlates with the size of your brand in terms of the number of customers you have, but it's very flat. Now, this applies in so many markets. I'll just show you quickly two more. This is two from our region: toothpaste in China, banks in Indonesia. The exact same pattern applies. Very flat lines. Loyalty's not varying much, and loyalty is clearly correlating with your market share or penetration. And again, quite much bigger differences in market share relative to loyalty. So they're the 3 points as why loyalty shouldn't be the focus. So let's revisit our loyalty truths. Customer loyalty varies significantly across brands. It doesn't generally. It's very unusual for that to happen. Superior loyalty is a key source of advantage, so we should be focusing on it. We would argue that in most cases, you're probably wasting your time to say, we are going to grow our brand by making our customers more loyal somehow. And extracting more from your brand's loyal customers is the best way to grow. And I think that loops in what we've just said, that really the evidence shows the growth tends to come from acquisition, not from achieving high loyalty. So let's go back to our Brazilian toothbrush brand. You recall that had grown quite strongly in market share and penetration, but this is a very predictable pattern from the double jeopardy law, that the loyalty measures varied to a much smaller degree. So you're looking at double market share, 6 to 14%, but average purchase frequency has gone from 2.3 to 3.1. Very predictable, and this pattern gets repeated over and over if you look in academic research as to how markets work, as to how people behave. So this is exactly what this brand should have expected. As we got more customers, our loyalty should increase, but not by a huge amount. So the important thing is to focus on the first two columns. So some implications for marketing. What is the role of marketing? It's an important question, but it's winning customers. And this is a quote from the late Andrew Ehrenberg, who was really one of the real thought leaders on double jeopardy and this idea of it's about acquisition, it's not about loyalty. He says what marketers do, so pricing, product formulation, advertising, promotions, that's really what dictates the different levels of sales a brand has, but it rarely causes additional differences in loyalty. Now, some people might be thinking, what are you saying? You're saying let's forget about our customers. We'll win a customer, we'll throw them in the pile, and we'll forget about it. That's absolutely not the case, because if you do that, if you leave your customers in an unhappy state, then it will absolutely affect acquisition, because you're going to get horrible word of mouth. No one's going to want to become your customer. So you can't forget about your current customers, but putting resources in to try and actively improve loyalty is destined to fail. So what should we do then? I think our point is you need to be informed and realistic about your brand's loyalty. And it's important to understand what is your brand's loyalty relative to its penetration or its market share. So firstly, it could be it's completely in line with your penetration. This is most likely going to be the answer, because double jeopardy applies, loyalty is quite predictable. So if that's the case, you don't really need to do anything. It's completely to be expected. So you might be a smaller brand and go, oh, that's a problem. We have less loyal customers. It's not a problem. If you're a bigger brand, if you've got more loyal customers, you shouldn't be patting yourself on the back too much, because that's completely predictable. Secondly, does your brand have excess loyalty? And that's like, wow, we're really off the chart here. It's more than we would expect. It's above that line that we saw, more than we would expect compared to our penetration. That's great. Try and understand why, but and maintain that, but don't spend too much time thinking about it. And finally, the situation where you would want to focus on loyalty is you find, wow, your loyalty is much lower than your penetration would suggest it should be. And that's where you need to address, because there's some sort of problem, and the problem might be some sort of barrier for customers re-signing with your brand, some sort of distribution issue, which customers find it hard, even though they love your brand, to repurchase. But again, 2 and 3 are unusual. It's usually number 1 is you'll tend to find is the answer. So marketing activities should emphasise reach. The aim is to win new customers. It's about casting the net quite widely. So you need to aim to reach all buyers. That includes your potential buyers, the people that aren't looking at your brand, that aren't thinking about your brand, that aren't using your brand currently. And look, I could spend all day talking about how you can do that, but in terms of ensuring reach, make sure your brand is associated with key needs that are shared by a lot of people, because that's going to bring people into your brand. Use mediums for advertising that do give you large reach. I mean, it's probably not rocket science. And be memorable, stand out, so that customer that doesn't use you, your brand sticks in their mind, such as the pair of trainers that we saw in the last presentation. And be consistent. You want to stick in people's minds. Don't change your packaging, don't change your messaging, don't change your colours every 2 years because you think progression or change is necessary. Only change if there's really something wrong. And finally, loyalty programs. I think you just need to be wary of loyalty programs, and the questions we would recommend you ask. Will it attract new customers? And it's quite a legitimate reason. It might actually be an acquisition program. It might be that a rewards program might actually bring customers in because they say, great, I'm going to start using that airline, I'm going to get rewarded. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to improve loyalty. It probably won't. It simply may just be a competitive necessity. You might find in certain categories like coffee, for example, everyone has a loyalty program. So you just think, look, I just need to do it to keep up with my competitors. Again, otherwise it may affect my future acquisition chances. Thirdly, it might be to retain your most high-value customers, which I think is another legitimate reason to have a rewards program or a loyalty program. But you need to think about what proportion of sales do these people contribute? Does it justify the cost? And finally, you might want a program for other reasons. So for collecting customer data, for example. But ultimately, if it's the main objective is to outperform competitors on loyalty, it's likely to be ineffective. So I will leave you with the final thought, and thanks for listening.